Hi, my name is Trish, and in this video, I will be talking about the books that I will be reading for September and October. Now, I usually don't do TBR videos. I think the last one that I did was my very first video, the one that I first posted when I started my channel. The reason why I don't do TBR videos is because I don't want to be held accountable when I can't actually do the shit that I said I will be doing. Posting TBR videos is too much for me because I do not want to air out my TBR list in public and have people call me out when I do not read them. But I will be doing a TBR video for September and October because I have actually something exciting planned for myself because I am a selfish person. So the past months have been very rough for all of us. And for me, I've been staying at home since March, and it's put me in a place where I've had to reflect and think about my life, my past, and my future. And most of the time, that is not a very good experience. But there are times when it is good and I become nostalgic about things that happened years before. And so for September and October, I actually plan to be rereading the books that I liked back when I was in elementary and high school. Now, how did I narrow down and choose these books? Basically, I chose the books that I could remember because obviously I don't have my old library cards with me, although that would have been cool. So I chose these books out of memory because if I remember them years after I read them, it must have been for a reason. So yeah, that is the criteria. So I have my list of books to read here, but before I delve into the books, a bit of a background on who Elementary Trish was as a reader. So I grew up in a family that actually supported and encouraged reading books. So a lot of the books that I read back when I was in elementary up until I graduated high school was from my school library. I don't want to be dramatic, but I did write something here about Elementary Trish. I guess I could read it for content. Elementary Trish was a whimsical child. She's just had access to an expansive library and all the freedom to read anything she wanted. This is an homage to a child whose world was only limited by her imagination, and whose escape was only limited by how many books she could read in a week. So the first book that I will be rereading from my elementary list is There's a Boy in the Girls' Bathroom by Louisa Carr. And I remember this book because this is the first book that I read where the main protagonist was a very unlikable and problematic character. All of the books that I've read up until this one usually featured a main protagonist who was a role model. This was a character who I could emulate and follow and look up to, and this character was not it. So we follow Bradley Chalkers, who is actually a bully, so none of his classmates like him, understandably so. No one wants to hang out with him, no one wants to play with him, no one wants to do anything with him. And then this new school counselor arrives, and she believes that Bradley is just a misunderstood child who's dealing with a lot of negative things back in home, and he doesn't know how to cope with it or to express it in a good and healthy way. And so the story is basically Bradley trying to be a better person with the help of that school counselor. And I think this is the first book where I got to experience really dissecting and thinking about a character and how they develop throughout the story. It was my first introduction to a complex character, and I believe that's why I remembered it, and I'm really excited to read it. The next book I will be rereading is Matilda by Roald Dahl. This was the book that made me a reader. This was the book that started it all. This book resulted into all of this. Not the tequila, just the books. So Matilda follows Matilda, who is this girl with very unloving parents. And so she reads books to escape, and she discovers that she has magical powers. I first saw the movie before I actually got to read the book. And when I read the book, it was such an otherworldly experience for me. It was really the first time where I felt like I could relate to a fictional character, where I felt understood by a fictional character, because a lot of times I actually also read for escapism. And so I understood Matilda's want and need to read about characters with better lives and who lived in worlds far different from hers. The next book on my list is The Little Prince by Antoine de I really should Google how these names are pronounced before I start filming. Antoine de Saint Exupéry. I'm so sorry. I actually don't remember a lot about this book, not a lot enough to give a good blurb or summary about it. I do, however, remember the feelings I had when I read this book. This was actually recommended to me by my cousin, and when I first read it, I remember feeling very whimsical and trippy, and I felt like I was in a dream. And there were times when it was very magical. There were also times when it was very scary because I did not understand what the fuck was going on. I do, however, remember two very specific scenes. The first is the scene where the kid was showing this drawing of a boa constrictor swallowing an elephant, and the adults thought it was a hat, so he had to redraw it in some sort of x-ray style where you could see the elephant inside of the boa constrictor. It was fun. The other scene that I also remember was when the prince was asking the pilot to draw him a sheep. I think it was a sheep. Yeah, it was a sheep. And the pilot showed him many variations of sheep, and the prince was not having it. And I guess the pilot lost his patience, or he just had a burst of creativity. So he drew this box with holes and told the prince that the sheep is inside that box. And the prince was all, wow! The next book on my list is the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine. I think Goosebumps is a very fundamental part of every childhood reading experience. So obviously I won't be rereading the entire series, but I will be rereading 4 books from the classic Goosebumps list. So those are Say Cheese and Die, Night of the Living Dummy, The Scarecrow Walks at Night, and Welcome to the Dead House, I think. So 4 books. I think that's enough for me to gauge the overall quality of the series and, give a proper review about it. The next on my list is The Babysitter's Club by Anne Martin. This was a very influential book series for me. I remember a time when all I read for the entire school year were Babysitter's Club books because my school library had a very extensive collection of those books. This series introduced me to a lot of more grown-up, more mature topics regarding friendship and relationships and just life in general. It was the first time I read about relationships, about Marianne and Logan. Yes, Marianne and Logan were my first bookish OTP. I may or may not have cried when they broke up. It was also through this series that I first found out about diabetes. Diabetes was not something that I knew about up until I read the book about Stacy being diabetic. And for those who are curious, my favorite babysitter is Christy Thomas because she was rugged and sporty, and we would have been friends instantly. So for this series, I will be rereading 3 books, and those are the first 3 books of the series. The first one where they start the club, the second one with the phantom phone calls with Claudia, and the third one about Stacy where we first find out that she's diabetic. The next on my list is Nancy Drew by Carolyn Keene. Now, Nancy Drew was one of my very first bookish role models. This series was also my first introduction to mystery thrillers, which is a genre that I grew to really, really love. Nancy Drew is dear to my heart because she was the first character I encountered where she had to rely on her smarts. Like, she was the smart one model character for me. She was my Hermione before I actually met Hermione. So for this series, I will only be reading 2 books, and those are the first 2 books in the series. I think it's The Hidden Staircase and something about a clock. I don't know. I'll just post it somewhere there. And the last book/series that I will be rereading are the Witch comics. I cannot begin to explain how influential Witch comics is to my life, not only as a reader but also as an artist, because I'm a self-taught artist and a lot of my practice with anatomy actually came from Witch comics. I would study the characters and how they pose, and I would try to recreate them. Story time. When I was 9 years old, my mom actually made me burn all of my Witch comics because she believed that it was the devil. The devil! And no matter how many times I tried to tell her that no, they're not actually witches. Witch is just a combination of all their first names. She made me burn them anyway. And I don't want to say this, I don't want to be mean because I love my mom. I do. I really do. But joke's on her, I guess, because every time I draw, witch is there. Sorry, Mom. Now, those are all the books that I liked in elementary that I will be rereading for September. However, I do want to share a few other series that did not make the cut but were just as memorable to me. The first is Two of a Kind. You know, that book series with Mary-Kate and Ashley. I remember one specific book, and it was One Twin Too Many. And I remember this because... let me collect myself. So in the story, Mary-Kate likes this guy, but it seems like this guy likes Ashley, so Ashley ends up liking this guy too, and so Ashley and Mary-Kate fight over this guy. The funny thing about it is the guy's name. I remember this book specifically because of the guy's name. This kid was named Pokey Valentine. Pokey Valentine. Let's just give a few seconds of silence, send thoughts and prayers to this character who had the misfortune of being named Pokey Valentine because clearly his parents didn't love him. The next are the Enid Blyton books, and I remember these books because you see how books are usually drawn in cartoons and animated movies, and they look so compact and so perfect in a character's hands. That is how Enid Blyton's books felt to me. Like, they were small, they were yay big, they were small and hardbound, and when I held them, they really felt like the perfect book. Like, the texture, the size, the weight, it was just all balanced. But of course, the stories were also very interesting. The first Enid Blyton book that I borrowed was Pretty Star the Pony because I really liked horses. The next is Sweet Valley High, and for my elementary self, this was the more grown-up, mature counterpart to the Babysitter's Club. I enjoyed following Elizabeth and Jessica because they were living the life that my sheltered life couldn't afford me to. Like, they went on dates, they had fights, they had drama. It was all fun, but I don't think I would have as much fun if I reread it now, so I won't be rereading it. And now onto the books that I liked back in high school and will be reading for October. So high school Trish was a bit more experimental with the books that she read. Like, at that point in my life, I really didn't know what kind of genres I really liked or favored. My reading taste was all over the place. I read contemporary, I read historical fiction, mystery thrillers, horrors, literary fiction, romance, everything. I read everything. So the first book on my list is The Cry of the Icemark by Stuart Hill. I loved this book back in high school. I adored it. This was the last book that I made a book report about. And I distinctly remember this book not only because it had a really great story, but also because it was the first heavy fantasy book where the main protagonist was a girl. And she wasn't the smart one. She wasn't the bow and arrow kind of girl. She was the knight in shining armor kind of character. She was the shield and hammer kind of character. She was the I'm going to lead the troops to Helm's Deep kind of character. She was the I am no man kind of character. Basically, she was the kind of character that I usually saw given to male leads in the fantasies that I've read before, up until this one. So we follow Thirin, Freer, strong in the arm, Lyndon Shield, as she struggles to lead her kingdom after her father dies in battle. So there's the threat of war looming close from another kingdom. And so in order to defend her own kingdom, she has to form an alliance with a number of unexpected creatures and enemies. I'm not gonna lie, a part of me is scared about rereading this book because what if I don't love it as much as I did before? I'm not ready to think that far ahead, so for the meantime, I'm just going to be excited about the prospect of rereading this. The next book on my list is The Shakespeare Secret by Jennifer Lee Carell. This is a historical mystery thriller that follows this stage or theater director. What's her name? Kate. It follows Kate as she goes on this adventure to solve the murder of her friend that might be connected to this deeper conspiracy theory involving Shakespeare. This is a brand of mystery thriller that I really like. I love those Dan Brown kind of thrillers, you know, the ones where they give very specific clues and sources and references, the sort of references that you can actually Google and find in real life. There's this one scene where one of the clues was actually found in the Bible I think it was in Psalms. Yes, Psalms. So the clue was, if if you count a specific number from the start of the psalm and the end of the psalm is gonna form the word Shakespeare. So I opened my Bible because back then I carried a Bible wherever I went. Yes, I was that kind of girl. I opened my Bible and I went to that psalm, counted a specific number of times from the start and the end, and it formed Shakespeare. It formed Shakespeare. So super excited to reread this because I remember really, really enjoying this. The next book on my list is Angry Housewives Eating Bonbons by Lorna Landvik. This is adult contemporary fiction that follows this group of housewives that form a book club, and so we follow their individual lives and their friendship throughout the years. This book is very special to me because first, it was the first book that I bought with my own money. I bought it from book sale using some of the leftover money that I won in competitions. Second, it was also the first book where I got to encounter and read about and think about a lot of sensitive, sometimes taboo topics that I usually would not encounter in the books that I read. So reading this book was a very grown-up experience for me back then, and I'm excited to see what that experience will be for me now that I'm an actual grown-up. The next book that I will be rereading is Diana, Her Own Story in Her Own Words by Andrew Morton. I love Diana. I adore her, and my love for her is actually a generational thing that's been passed down from my grandmother. You know, my grandmother adores her, my mother adores her, I adore her, my kid is gonna adore her. There was this time in high school where I had a very royal fanatic phase, and all I read about were memoirs and autobiographies about historical figures and other royal historical fiction books. Now, I know this is a controversial book. I don't know if it's still controversial. I think it is based on the comments that I saw on Goodreads, but I'll be rereading this mainly for the nostalgia and, my love for Diana. The next book on my list is The Supernaturalist by Eowyn Colfer. I am not big on sci-fis. I do not like sci-fis and dystopians because those genres scare me. So I actually picked this up when I was in high school because a classmate of mine bought it from the Scholastics book fair. I didn't buy anything because I couldn't afford it, and she liked it so much, so she recommended it to me and lent me her copy. And I remember just being really spooked about this book. I was scared, but at the same time, I sort of enjoyed it. There were a lot of things that I didn't understand back then, so I'm excited to reread this and to be able to process it with a more grown-up set of mind. The next book on my list is The Last Cheshire by Janet S. Anderson. I'm sorry. I'm laughing because I don't actually remember finishing this book back when I was in high school. What I do remember was I was reading it during my Chinese class and my teacher caught me, so she confiscated it for a week. And back then we could only borrow books for about a week. So when the due date came, I went to her office. I was my most humble and contrite self. I basically begged her to give the book back to me, and she was merciful and gave it back. And I was thankful for that because I could not afford to pay any overdue fees in the library. So the book follows this boy who finds out that he is supposed to inherit this treasure, but in order to get that treasure, I think he has to go through some sort of obstacles and puzzles to uncover secrets about his family. I'm not so sure. Maybe. I just found out that you can see the fluff of my microphone. What did Tom tell me this was called? A Dead Cat? And finally, the last book that I will be rereading is The Shanghai Girls by Lisa C. This is one of the first historical fiction books that I read, and it was also one of the first books that I read that wasn't very Western focused or Western toned, if that makes sense. It follows two sisters who migrate to America after their father loses his money, and so they have to build a new life there with a new family and with new husbands. And while they're sisters and the best of friends, they're also actually very bitter rivals, so a lot of things go on between the two of them. I remember liking this very much. I remember the enjoyment and the satisfaction of reading about lives and people that are very different from mine, so I'm very excited to reread this. Those are it for the books that I will be rereading from my high school days. But I also want to talk about some books/series that did not make the cut but were just as memorable to me. So first one is The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. I actually contemplated about whether or not I should reread it because high school Trish loved these books. Back then, the fourth book was not published yet, so there was only Aragon, Eldest, and Brisingar. Eldest was the last book I borrowed from my high school library, and Brisingar I borrowed from my friend. I remember finishing Brisingar and saying to myself, I'm going to wait for that last book to be published. I don't care if it takes me years to wait. I'm going to wait for it, and when it comes out, I'm going to finally finish this series. And years later, I'm an adult with a job. The fourth and last book has been published. I bought the entire series, and I did not like it. Adult Trish didn't like it. I reread Aragon, and I enjoyed it. I reread Eldest, and it was okay. I reread Brisingar, and I could not finish it. I could not understand how high school Trish thought this was the best book of all time. I could not stand to read a whole fucking chapter of Aragon making a sword. I also couldn't stand another second of blatant favoritism for the elves over dwarves. So imagine spending all those years waiting for this final book and not reading it. If high school Trish could time travel to the future, she would have beaten the shit out of me. The next book that was memorable to me but did not make the cut is the Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer. I won't be rereading it because it's problematic and I don't want to give it any more attention than it already has. Story time. So we all know Breaking Dawn is a thick-ass book, and I borrowed a copy from my friend and I didn't want to hold on to it for too long, so I read late into the night. My mother didn't like that, and so one night she caught me reading late. She confiscated the book, and the next day she told me that I won't be going to school. She told me to sit down on the dining table. She placed Breaking Dawn in front of me, and she told me that I will not be getting up off dining table until I finish the entire fucking book. And I had to invoke the spirits of Cherry Hill, of Noro Honor, of Lorna Tolentino, because I had to fucking act contrite and sorry when inside I was screaming, fuck yeah, I get to read the whole day. Please don't tell my mom that I really enjoy that punishment. The next book that was very memorable to me but did not make the cut is The Other Bolian Girl by Philippa Gregory. I read this during my royal fanatic phase back in high school, and this is actually very dear to my heart because it was recommended to me by my late Tita Tess. She was also a very avid reader, and what I really loved and appreciated about her was that when she talked to me about books, she didn't treat me like I was her high school niece. She treated me like I was a reader, and she was not afraid and did not hesitate to talk to me about the books that she liked and the topics and the issues that were talked about or addressed in those books. Basically, she treated me as a reader with my own mind and with my own prerogative in reading the books that I want. She was also the one who instilled in me and made me appreciate the idea of raising questions and challenging beliefs and ideas through the books that I read. You know, she was really the one who made me feel and know that if there's any place where I could open my mind and be free to ask questions, it was in a book. The next series/books that did not make the cut are John Grisham books. I was also very into lawyer fiction. I don't know why, but I really enjoyed John Grisham's works back in high school. I loved The Pelican Brief. I loved The Testament. I really loved The Street Lawyer, and I remember that one because of one very specific scene. So The Street Lawyer is about this guy who finds out something shady about his law firm and his conscience can take it, so he quits and starts this pro bono job for people on the streets. And he has this friend/partner who is a paralegal, and this partner has this business card where it has his name, and underneath his name is the word paralawyer, because his logic is, yes, he's a paralegal, but he practically has the experience of a lawyer, so paralawyer. That was a good time. And the last series/books that did not make the cut but was still very memorable to me were Dean Koontz books. It was strange because there weren't any Stephen King books back in my high school library, but there were a lot of Dean Koontz books, and it was strange for me because Dean Koontz also wrote a lot of scary horror stories with sensitive and graphic scenes. So I don't know how his books passed the vibe check from my very Christian, very conservative high school. One particular book of his I remember was A Door to December, and there was the scene where the characters were gathered in the kitchen and then the dial to the radio starts moving on its own. You know how a radio dial switches fast between channels and you catch snippets of words or phrases? So the radio starts moving and changing channels, and it starts forming words and sentences and says, "Run, get out, save your lives, run, get out." And it was fucking scary. I shouldn't have read that at 1 a.m. in the morning. So that is it for all the books that I will be rereading for September and October. Hopefully, I get to reread all of this. I'm fairly confident that my nostalgia is enough to drive me to actually read all of this, but thoughts and prayers are appreciated.